After the Titanic, most people assume maritime law fixed the lifeboat problem for good, that every modern cruise ship is required to carry a seat for every single person on board. It isn't true. Today's regulations only require enough actual lifeboats to physically seat about 3/4 of everyone on the ship. That's not a loophole nobody noticed. It's the written rule, on purpose, and the reasoning behind it is stranger than the shortfall itself. Start with the scale of a modern megaship, because the numbers make the gap obvious fast. A ship like Icon of the Seas can carry close to 10,000 passengers and crew combined at full capacity. Reporting on its safety equipment puts its lifeboat seating at somewhere around 7,600, enough for roughly 3/4 of everyone aboard, not all of them. Walk the promenade deck of almost any large cruise ship and count the lifeboats yourself. You'll find somewhere between 16 and 20 of them, hanging in rows along each side, bright orange, impossible to miss once you know to look. Do the math on capacity per boat, and it never quite reaches the number printed on the ship's safety certificate for total persons on board. For a moment, that looks like exactly the failure everyone assumes was fixed over a century ago. Here's where the actual regulation gets specific, and it's worth knowing the real wording, because it's more deliberate than a gap left open by accident. The rule comes from SOLAS, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, specifically Chapter 3, Regulation 21. It requires lifeboats on each side of the ship sufficient for at least 37.5% of everyone on board. Multiply that by the two sides of the vessel, and you get 75% of total persons covered by hard lifeboats alone. On top of that 75%, the ship has to carry inflatable life rafts covering an additional 25%, bringing the combined total to 100%. And then, on top of even that, the rule requires yet another layer of life rafts equal to 25% more, pushing total aggregate survival craft capacity to 125% of everyone on board. Read that again. There is technically more emergency seating on a modern cruise ship than there are people to fill it. The part people fixate on, the actual rigid lifeboats, is deliberately capped at 75%, with life rafts built in to cover the rest by design, not by shortfall. To understand why regulators landed on that specific split instead of just requiring more lifeboats, you have to go back to where this entire framework started. In 1912, the Titanic sank carrying only 20 lifeboats, enough capacity for barely half the roughly 2,200 people on board, and even those boats left the water partly empty because of how chaotic and untested the evacuation was. Some lifeboats designed for 65 people were lowered carrying 20 or 30 because crews had never drilled the process and nobody was confident the davits could handle a full load without failing under the strain. There was no muster list, no assigned station, no rehearsal of any kind. Passengers found out where to go, if they found out at all, from crew members improvising in real time. Public outrage was immediate and international, and just 2 years later, in 1914, the first version of SOLAS was signed specifically to make sure that particular failure could never happen again. Early SOLAS rules pushed hard toward 100% lifeboat coverage for everyone on board, and for decades, that's roughly what ships carried. But as passenger ships kept getting larger across the 20th century, engineers ran into a physical problem nobody drafting the 1914 treaty ever had to think about. The rules kept evolving as ship sizes grew, and almost none of the changes moved in the direction most people would guess. A 1948 update to SOLAS made motorized lifeboats mandatory on larger vessels, since early boats had relied entirely on oars and a road evacuation across open. Freezing water was its own kind of disaster waiting to happen. By 1960, amendments formally allowed life rafts to substitute for a portion of lifeboat capacity for the first time, opening the door to the split system used today. The whole treaty was consolidated again in 1974 into the version still amended and used now, folding decades of separate revisions into one living document that keeps getting updated every time ship design outpaces it. Each revision was a direct response to ships outgrowing what the previous generation of rules had assumed, and that pattern hasn't stopped. It's still happening today, which is exactly why the numbers on a ship like Icon of the Seas look the way they do, rather than mirroring what a treaty written for much smaller ocean liners originally assumed. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, this is a good moment to do it, because the story is about to swing from a rule on paper to an actual disaster that tested it in the real world, and you don't want to miss where this goes. A traditional lifeboat, the kind you picture from old films, was limited to carrying around 150 people. On a ship carrying 5, 6, even 10,000 passengers and crew, covering everyone in boats that size alone would require dozens of them lined up along the hull, eating up deck space that today's ships need for cabins, restaurants, and the very amenities that make people want to cruise in the first place. The launch of Oasis of the Seas in 2009, with a capacity above 6,000 people, forced the issue directly. Covering that many passengers in old-style lifeboats would have needed around 38 separate boats, stacked along both sides of the hull in a way that would have swallowed entire decks that were supposed to hold cabins and public spaces. Engineers responded by building larger lifeboats instead, some now capable of carrying 370 to over 400 people each, more than double the old capacity while only around 50% longer. Oasis ended up carrying 18 of these larger lifeboats, enough to cover nearly all passengers and most crew, without needing to wrap boats around the entire length of the hull. But even with bigger boats, physically fitting 100% of a 10,000 person capacity in rigid lifeboats alone on both sides of a ship that size remains a genuine engineering constraint. Life rafts became the pressure release valve that made the math work without needing a completely different kind of ship. There's a real engineering reason life rafts make sense as that backup layer, beyond simply being smaller and cheaper to store. A rigid lifeboat has to be lowered by a mechanical davit system, which needs the ship reasonably close to upright to work safely and needs trained crew physically present to run it. SOLAS specifies that lifeboats have to be launchable even with the ship listing up to 20 degrees and trimmed up to 10 degrees, a generous margin on paper. A life raft works differently. Most are packed into hard canisters, mounted along the deck, connected to a hydrostatic release unit, a mechanism that automatically triggers and lets the raft float free and self-inflate if the ship goes underwater before anyone gets the chance to launch it by hand. On paper, life rafts are the more failure-resistant part of the system, which is exactly why regulators leaned on them to cover the buffer capacity instead of just mandating more davits along the hull. On paper is the important phrase there, because this entire framework was tested once, for real, and the result is more complicated than the regulation makes it sound. In January 2012, the cruise ship Costa Concordia struck rocks off the Italian island of Giglio with over 4,200 passengers and crew on board. The hull tore open along nearly 230 feet of the port side, and the ship began taking on water fast. For close to an hour after impact, passengers were told the problem was an electrical fault, not a breach, while the crew scrambled behind the scenes without a clear command structure and without sounding the general emergency alarm that was supposed to send everyone to their muster stations immediately. That delay matters enormously to what happened next, because it ate directly into the very thing the entire lifeboat and life raft system depends on: time and a ship that's still close to level. Then the list began. And that list is where the entire design gets tested against reality instead of paperwork. Investigators later found that even at an angle of just 15 degrees, 5 degrees less than SOLAS boats are supposedly rated for, launching became effectively impossible in practice. As Concordia's list passed 20 degrees and kept worsening, lifeboats on the low side jammed against the hull itself, unable to swing clear, while crews on the high side found their boats hanging uselessly away from the ship instead of down toward the water. Passageways that were flat corridors an hour earlier had become steep, disorienting slopes that passengers had to climb using furniture and railings. In the end, 3 of the ship's 26 lifeboats never launched at all. Only 3 of its 69 life rafts made it into the water, not because the hydrostatic releases malfunctioned, but because the evacuation itself was chaotic and delayed, with many passengers never properly mustered before the order to abandon ship finally came, more than an hour after the initial impact. The evacuation that international guidelines expect to take somewhere between 60 and 80 minutes on a ship this size ended up taking more than 6 hours on Concordia. 32 people died. And the sobering detail investigators kept coming back to afterward is that the death toll would very likely have been dramatically higher in open ocean, far from land, without nearby islands, private boats, and helicopters able to reach the ship within the hour. Concordia settled close to shore, in shallow water, within sight of a town that could send help almost immediately. The system that's legally allowed to leave 25% of a ship's population without a guaranteed lifeboat seat was quietly relying, that night, on rescue conditions that don't exist everywhere. A cruise ship actually sails, conditions that would look completely different 1,000 miles from the nearest coastline. This is genuinely one of the more uncomfortable stories in modern maritime safety. And if you want to understand how the rest of the industry actually works instead of how it's supposed to work on paper, subscribing is the easiest way to catch the next one of these. So why hasn't the rule simply been rewritten to require lifeboats for everyone? Full stop. After a real-world test exposed exactly this weakness. Partly because the underlying math the regulation was built on assumes an orderly evacuation on a ship that's still close to upright. And under those specific conditions, the 125% aggregate system genuinely does work close to as designed, launching lifeboats and life rafts side by side rather than relying on one or the other alone. Concordia wasn't really a failure of the 75 and 25 split in isolation. It was a failure of the assumption sitting underneath the entire framework, that crews would recognize the emergency, alert everyone immediately, and begin a controlled launch long before any dangerous list ever developed. And partly, it comes down to the same physical constraint that created the split in the first place. Put the actual numbers on a mid-sized ship carrying 3,000 people, and full lifeboat coverage would mean rigid boats for all 3,000, split across both sides of the hull. Even using the newer, larger capacity lifeboats, that's a wall of davits and boats running almost the entire length of the ship on both sides, leaving very little room for the balconies, dining rooms, and glass-walled promenades that are, commercially, most of what a passenger is paying for. Retrofitting an existing fleet to that standard would mean either shrinking passenger capacity significantly or rebuilding hulls from scratch, and regulators have generally judged that the safer, more achievable path is tightening everything around the evacuation itself, rather than simply mandating more steel hanging off the sides of every ship afloat. There's also a weight argument sitting quietly underneath all of this. A fully loaded, rigid lifeboat carrying 400 people is itself an enormous mass hanging off davits many decks above the waterline, and every additional one of those changes the very stability math this channel has covered before. Piling on more high-mounted lifeboats to chase full coverage would fight against the ship's balance in exactly the way naval architects spend their careers trying to avoid. It's worth comparing this to how the aviation world handles a strikingly similar trade-off, because the logic runs almost exactly the same way. A commercial jet doesn't carry a personal parachute for every passenger either, and for the same underlying reason, the system isn't built around every individual escaping independently. It's built around keeping the vehicle itself controllable and getting it down safely as a whole. Cruise ships and aircraft both quietly bet on the same principle, that preventing the emergency and keeping the vessel stable enough to execute an orderly, procedural response does more for survival than stacking individual escape equipment for every single person on board ever could. It's not a comforting way to frame it, but it's the actual engineering philosophy sitting underneath both industries, and it's the reason neither one looks the way a worst-case first design would look. In the years afterward, regulators didn't leave it there. Crew training standards, mandatory muster drills before departure, and bridge decision support requirements were all significantly tightened. Muster drills today are held before the ship even leaves port, with passengers required to check in at their assigned station using scanned key cards, so crew can immediately see, on a digital manifest, exactly who has and hasn't reported, a direct response to how much time was lost on Concordia, simply figuring out who was still unaccounted for. The industry also pushed toward what's called safe return to port design, building newer ships so that critical systems, power, propulsion, and fire safety are duplicated and separated into isolated zones well enough that a single incident is far less likely to disable the whole vessel and force an evacuation into open water in the first place. Engine rooms are split so that a fire or flood in one zone can't take out propulsion and backup power at the same time, and the goal, on paper, is that the ship should almost always be able to limp to a dock under its own power rather than needing a full-scale abandonment at all. The philosophy shifted subtly but importantly. Instead of only asking whether there are enough boats for everyone, the newer question is how to make sure the ship almost never needs all of them launched under emergency conditions at all. What regulators didn't fundamentally change is the 75% lifeboat, 25% life raft split itself. Because on a ship that behaves the way the regulation assumes it will, that split still adds up to more capacity than people on board, which is really the honest answer to the question this video opened with. It is completely legal for a cruise ship to sail without a hard lifeboat seat for every single passenger, because the rule was never actually designed around lifeboats alone. It was designed around a combined system of lifeboats and life rafts that, added together, comes to more capacity than the ship's total population. A bet that an orderly evacuation, on a ship still close to level, will always make that math hold. Statistically, that bet holds an overwhelming majority of the time. Modern cruise ships are not sinking with any regularity, and most passengers will complete dozens of cruises across a lifetime without the lifeboats being anything more than a piece of orange scenery on the promenade deck, glanced at once during a muster drill and never thought about again. The industry's actual safety record over the last several decades backs that up. Concordia stands out precisely because incidents anywhere close to that scale are rare, not routine. But the math was always a bet on conditions, not a guarantee independent of them, and that distinction is exactly what got tested off the coast of Giglio in January 2012. For most of the history of modern cruising, that bet has held. Costa Concordia is the one time it was tested for real, and it barely did. Have you ever actually paid full attention during the safety briefing on a cruise, or tuned it out like almost everyone else on the ship? Be honest in the comments. Now you know exactly what that muster station number is actually for, and why the crew running that drill takes it a lot more seriously than most passengers do. This channel exists to pull apart exactly this kind of thing. The system's built quietly into every voyage that almost nobody stops to question until something goes wrong. If that's the kind of engineering you're here for, subscribe, because there's a lot more of it to get in.